And here's the twist.
Please welcome to the stage Axios Health Policy Reporter, Maya Goldman.
Hello, good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for coming out this morning. We're really happy to have you here. My name is Maya Goldman. I'm an Axios Health reporter and co-author of the Axios Vitals newsletter. Subscribe if you don't already, it's free. Welcome to Axios' Closing the Gap, Policy, Cost, and Specialty Care. National health policy is at a crossroads with complex regulations, rising costs, pressures, federal decisions shaping everything. And innovation is continuing to advance, but patients, especially those with chronic conditions, cancer, rare disease, are still struggling almost more than ever to afford their medication. And there are significant barriers and things to unpack. So I'm very excited to be joined by leaders working to close those gaps today. Please welcome our first guest, Priscilla VanderVeer, Executive Director of No Patient Left Behind. Thanks for joining us this morning. It's great to see you.
Thank you.
So No Patient Left Behind is a coalition of biotech companies, investors, patients, focused on innovation and affordability for medications, right? And you've been vocal, your organization has been vocal, in your opposition to strong government intervention in drug pricing, which is sort of the way that the administration has been going, the last two administrations, with Most Favored Nation and Medicare drug price negotiations. So what's behind your thinking there? Why do you think that that's the wrong approach? And what do you think is the right approach?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting conversation that we keep having and have had for a long time about the, quote, high price of drugs. I think that there is a lot to be said about what's happening to patients at the pharmacy counter, and I don't fault policymakers who are looking for solutions to that. Mm-hmm. I think when we talk about solutions like MFN, like the Inflation Reduction Act, which is a slightly different situation than MFN, we're looking at a problem that may not actually, or a solution that may not solve the problem. So when you talk to patients, where they experience the biggest pain is at the pharmacy counter. And what we often see with these solutions is that the cost for the patient doesn't actually go down. So what is in MFN that's actually going to solve the affordability problem for patients, I think is the number one question that we ask at No Patient Left Behind. And at the same time, if you are undervaluing innovation and the medicines that patients need today and in the future, what's going to be available to them? So it's sort of a dual problem. And I think, when we talk about MFN, we're talking about importing structures from around the world that have, completely different healthcare systems than we do, that have completely different value structures than we do, both values as far as what they value for patients when it comes to the access and availability of new medicines, as well as the value assessments that those countries use that we have typically shied away from here in the US. So, what is a patient's life worth and how is that decided? And when we look at how other countries do that, it's very different than how we assess it. And I would say, interestingly, it's seen as a pretty universally bad idea. So I was at a conference last week at Tufts, and we don't often agree with folks at, let's say, ICER, who use QALYs and other measures that we don't necessarily think accurately reflect the true value and what patients value in their medicine.
Quality adjusted life year.
Thank you. And I think there was agreement between someone who is very strongly defending industry and somebody who was from ICER about how bad of an idea MFN is because of those issues. And when we look at what the affordability solutions are, some of the most popular pieces of the Inflation Reduction Act are the affordability pieces, the $2,000 out-of-pocket cap, the $35 insulin, the spreading your cost over the year. That's what is most often felt directly by patients. And now that we're about 4 months in to the first year of those maximum fair price drugs, those negotiated drugs, I would love to see our seniors actually paying less for the drugs, those first 10 drugs. I'm not sure that they are, and I want to see that data because that's the key thing we're trying to solve for. And the solution to do that is to make sure that insurance is working like it should, and to make sure that drugs are covered from day one, that we've got caps on out-of-pocket costs, that if you are buying a drug on Trump RX or another direct-to-consumer platform, that that's going to your out-of-pocket maximum, that these are the real things that actually fix the problem that we're trying to address.
Yeah. So this is all coming at a time when there's a lot of pressure on health insurance companies from Capitol Hill to change their business models. And there have been policy changes that have made coverage less available for patients. So how do you get to those wonky policy details when people maybe don't even have healthcare coverage?
Yeah, it's a huge issue. And we are on record of supporting subsidies in the ACA. I think it's gonna start to become clear after Q1 ends, where you have that grace period of not paying a premium in your ACA plan. We're gonna start to see a lot of people lose their coverage, I think, in the next few months. And that is going to be devastating for folks. I think there are safety nets somewhat available from a medicine perspective. There are more and more cash pay programs available. There are patient assistance programs. All of those things exist to try to bridge those gaps. But I think we're gonna start seeing those challenges. I think the challenge I have when we talk about what happens, when we pass laws that, quote, increase premiums. So the first thing that insurers say whenever you talk about some reform that will lower out-of-pocket costs for patients, whether it's medicines or otherwise, is, well, premiums will go up. My response to that is premiums already go up and patients get less and they pay more out of pocket every single year. So if our premiums are gonna go up, I would say if you talk to most people, they're willing to pay a few extra dollars to know that their medicine is covered. If you could predict beyond Medicare, if you're in an ACA plan, for example, that, oh, I know throughout the year, I'm not gonna have to pay more than $2,000, that's huge.
Yeah.
And that's approximately 7% of the people on an ACA plan would even reach that level. So we're not talking about a huge population of people, but we're talking about a massive impact on those folks. And so, again, I'm happy to have a conversation about how that would impact premiums, how that would impact utilization management and formularies, and the amount that pharma companies might have to pitch in to improve that access. But at the end of the day, if what we truly want to solve is affordability, that's how we solve it.
Yeah. So right now, the Trump administration is still very interested in most favored nation, moving towards that, trying to get Congress to pass something that would codify that. And we've seen large drug companies make individual deals with the administration to try to alleviate some of those policies. That's harder for smaller companies like the ones in your coalition to do. So what impact does that dynamic have on innovation?
Yeah, it's significant, and we're seeing it already. So, it's not a large pharma versus small pharma situation. The ecosystem operates because all of these different size companies, all of these companies focusing on different things, all work together. The challenge comes in when you have a very large pharmaceutical company that can go in, they have a lot of drugs on Medicaid and Medicare, and they can manage those costs. If you are a small company, maybe you're even pre-revenue, which means you're not making any money yet, you may not even have a drug on market, or you have maybe one drug. What is your negotiating leverage to go in and make a deal? What does that look like for you? And if you're still trying to get funding to bring a drug to market, if you are a small company, you can talk to any investors, whether it's venture capital or other investing firms, equity firms, whatever, they will say, we are already factoring in to our calculations and our investments what a world with MFN would look like.
Yeah.
So for drugs that might come out 10, 15 years from now, those companies are already losing potential money now. We are also seeing fewer, because of the IRA, we're seeing fewer investments into small molecule drugs, which are not just pills. They're also complex radiograph gene editing technologies that also fall under that penalty of the 9 years where they start to get price controlled. So all of those things just hit those companies faster and harder and more directly, whereas pharma can kind of adjust in the short term at least. The innovation impacts will hit them 100% on the larger companies, but the smallers really feel it much earlier.
Yeah, and just to, put a fine point on it, why do you think it's so important that we have small companies that are able to innovate?
Yeah, I think if you look at the way that our ecosystem operates, it can be very difficult for a large pharma company to focus on one molecule. They're managing, the global development and manufacturing of drugs. A small company has a lot of flexibility. They have an ability to focus on one thing, and they can spend that time. And what often happens, and a lot of people sort of talk down about this, but the way those companies operate is to ultimately then partner with and/or get acquired by a large company to bring their product to scale, because they don't have the ability to do global manufacturing or domestic manufacturing. They need those companies for large-scale clinical trials, but the way that it operates is they can take on so much of the risk, and then if it's successful, then you get that reward.
Yeah.
And that's how our system has operated.
It's an ecosystem.
It's an ecosystem, yeah.
Yeah. So switching gears just slightly, there's been a lot of change at FDA in the last year and a half, especially in leadership roles at CBER. How do you see that affecting innovation and affordability? And we're also coming up on a PDUFA reauthorization.
Yes.
So what are your FDA, in an ideal world for No Patient Left Behind, what does FDA look like?
Yeah, I think I think part of the challenge is we have a lot of conversations about, we want to make it easier to bring drugs to market. When we talk about that, we mean how do we make it easier to do trials? How do we make it easier to understand what the rules of the game are? What is the structure that we're operating in? That is the number one challenge, I think, facing
just understanding the structure?
Understanding what the rules are right now.
Yeah.
So we operate very much in a predictability phase. So if you think that you've gotten approval for your trial, and then at the end of the day, they're like, actually, never mind, that creates chaos. It also creates less investment. It means that folks are not going to spend their money, investors are not going to put money into that if they can't have a more predictable outcome. And all we're looking for is not less standards. It's not, making it easier, bringing drugs to market without the appropriate rigor in clinical trial development. It's just about knowing what the rules of the road are, about the transparency, about predictability. All of these things are what's most important. And there are things that we're focused on in PDUFA. There's a lot of modernization. How are we taking the lessons we learned during COVID of decentralized trials? How are we ensuring that we can still globally develop medicines and run those trials? We have to do that. There's not enough patients in the United States to run large-scale clinical trials. We have to do it globally. But how does that structure take place? And again, it all goes back to what are the rules of the road? And we have been, for decades, the gold standard of scientific rigor.
Yeah.
And we want to maintain that.
Yeah.
It gives companies a peace of mind to know that those rigorous processes have been followed. And that's what we want. We don't want it to just be somewhat political or arbitrary.
Right. Yeah. What's your number one priority for PDUFA?
Number one priority, that's tough because there's so many things. I think to get it reauthorized is the number one priority, and make sure that that happens and that the FDA is funded.
Yeah.
I think secondarily, it's how do we modernize some of our processes to reflect the growing role of AI, the growing role of how are we analyzing? We can analyze so much more data much more quickly. So how is that reflected in the rules of the road under PDUFA? How are we making sure that we're meeting PDUFA deadlines and that we're meeting those targets and that it's clear who is in charge of what? And then finally, that FDA maintains its strength and has the staff that it needs to get it done. I think for us, that is a huge priority, is making sure the agency has the resources and staff it needs to do that.
Yeah. Well, unfortunately, we are out of time. Went by so fast. Thank you so much, Priscilla. Great to have you here.
Thank you so much, Maya.
Thank you, everybody.
Please welcome to the stage Axios healthcare policy reporter, Peter Sullivan.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks again for being here. I'm Peter Sullivan, along with Maya, another one of our Axios healthcare reporters and Vitals newsletter co-authors. So we're really excited to keep the conversation going with a voice in Congress, leading voice on healthcare issues, who's a physician himself. So please join me in welcoming Congressman Greg Murphy. Congressman, thanks so much.
Good morning, good morning.
Good morning. So as I said, I mean, you obviously are a doctor. So, I mean, maybe let's go to your experience. I mean, in your practice, what barriers do you see to patients getting specialty care, getting the care that they need?
You know, Peter, one of the things, I actually still practice, so I still see patients and still hear these stories every day. I had a fellow in my office 6-8 weeks ago that had changed insurances because the company he worked for, and all of a sudden the drug he'd been on for several years, instead of being $50 a month, was $1,500 a month. And I literally pulled out my phone and went to Cost Plus and said, here's this drug, and it's $15 a month. I think the greatest access problem that we're having now is because we've allowed very quietly has come into the forefront, the great middleman in medicine. It's been the vertical integration that, in my opinion, is the greatest problem that we're facing today in medicine.
Yeah, so I mean, to that point around insurers, sort of the payment, you've been very active on prior authorizations also. An insurer has to pre-approve a treatment. I mean, do you see that a lot? And in terms of the policy, I mean, can Congress pass something on that, or where do you see that going?
This has become now an accelerating problem with our insurance industry, is denial, obstruction, and delay. That we've seen time and time again. And, you know, I don't have a problem with saying, hey, let's stop and make sure that this is the right thing. The sad thing is that insurance companies are becoming doctors, and they are making medical decisions, whereas opposed to the decision between a patient and I, when I recommend a therapy, they have somebody who's behind a screen that's never seen a patient making the medical decision. It is a real problem, and sadly enough, it's actually getting worse and worse.
Do you see, I mean, is this something the administration has announced some voluntary agreements with insurers? Yeah. I mean, do we need to go farther than that? Does there need to be a statute?
Well, yes, we need to go. Yes, we need to go further. Actually, last summer, Dr. Oz convened, I think, the insurers that led about 70% of covered lives in this country and brought them all in. So they saw an administration that's actually going to do something about this, that's going to carry a heavy stick. And they came in with a mea culpa. Yes, we've been wrong. We've been doing things badly, and we're going to be better. Sadly enough, I don't believe them, frankly, to be very blunt. I don't believe a thing that they say, because their motive is profit, and their motive is going to be returning money to their shareholders, and in any way possible to maximize their profits, they're going to do.
So in terms of physician policy, I mean, obviously physician pay is an issue. Congress often has to pass patches to try to prevent cuts. I mean, for a long time, people have talked about doing something longer term. Yeah. I mean, is there a chance of actually doing that? Maybe not this Congress, but building the groundwork at least for sort of bigger reforms to physician pay?
Yeah, Dr. Schrier and I are working on something that's going to be a little bit more long-term. I'm going to give you all an example of this, the perfect example of how the 33% cut to physician pay over the last 20 years, what it means. The day I resigned from my practice, a private practice in Eastern North Carolina, which has truly a very, very challenging payer mix. 75% of our patients were Medicare, Medicaid, or no insurance. And so literally the other 25% are who paid the bill. But the day I resigned from my practice, the practice I ran in Eastern North Carolina, my partners said, we can't do this anymore. We're going to go to the hospital, which is a much more expensive place of care, less efficient, and I believe less patient-friendly. Why is that a problem? Why did that occur? Because of physician payment cuts, we had not received a paycheck 3 out of the last 8 quarters. So I don't know any business model that can operate losing money continually. And, it's a major problem. And then driving with consolidation, the other factors, primarily a lot which came from the ACA, when you starve private physician practices, which I believe are the most patient-centered and the most efficient part of medicine, when you starve them, you kill them. What you're doing now is not only adding to the middlemen, you're actually adding to the bureaucracy and adding to the cost of care.
So, yeah, we're here talking about specialty care. It seems that maybe there's sometimes a bit of a tension, at least when it comes to pay, around specialty care versus primary care. Different people want to give a bump to primary versus a bump to specialty. I mean, is there a tension there, or can you address both of those?
Yeah, this is one of these self-inflicted wounds where you put the primary care specialists, the surgical specialists usually, but then you have, a lot of medical specialists versus those who deliver primary care. That's nonsense. We're on the same boat. Physicians, that's one thing different in politics, which I've had to get used to, is we all work together. We all work together with the patient against a disease, where politics are, antagonistic by nature. And it should not be that we should fight over one pot of money that one person gets and one person doesn't. We have to help our primary care people there, especially our pediatricians, and Dr. Schrier speak to this, our pediatricians, our family practice doctors, to bring them up. There's no reason that an advanced level practitioner should be making more than a primary care physician does. That's absolutely absurd. And so, the sad thing is we've had shrinking pots of money for those who actually deliver the care, while we're increasing the pots of money who actually benefit from them delivering care, i.e. insurance companies, PBMs, et cetera.
Yeah, so on that PBM point, I mean, you already mentioned Mark Cuban's company, Cost Plus, trying to disrupt the PBM model.
Yeah.
What more, and Congress has actually passed on a bipartisan basis some PBM reforms, maybe not the total package. What more on the sort of, do you see more PBM reforms that Congress could pass, or what else should be done?
Absolutely. I think some of the programs that Congress passed, Medicare Advantage, PBMs, were good in thought and process. Sadly enough, when you get in boardrooms of insurance companies, their job is how can we make profit? How can we push this? There's no other entity in this world, and I've done a lot of medicine in other countries, where a PBM exists, where you have essentially a group that makes money off of pharmaceutical companies. Again, the thought was, well, they can negotiate lower prices and those prices be passed on. But the sad fact is, and we've had some reform with this now recently, is PBMs were in no position to actually lower the cost of pharmaceuticals because they were paid as a percentage of the drug itself. Well, if you want to make more money, you're going to pick the higher cost drug. I met with a cardiology group 6 months ago that a new cardiac drug, which was more efficacious, it worked better, and it was cheaper than the present drug on market. They could not get on the formulary with the PBM because the PBM said, well, you're coming in at a lower cost than the one we have right now. That's absolutely absurd. And again, this is the main problem, I think, of what's happening in medicine right now, is that we are paying people who provide no value whatsoever to the patient. And again, every single time I talk about medicine, every single time, it should be about the patient that's in front of the physician. It shouldn't be about the insurer. It shouldn't be about somebody else. It should be about the patient that's in front of the physician. And when these folks, they deliver no value whatsoever to the care of the patient. And I think vast reform needs to occur in that space, if not total elimination.
So shifting in the drug pricing space, focusing a little more on the pharmaceutical companies themselves.
Sure.
President Trump has made these 16 deals with large pharmaceutical companies, most favored nation, he calls it, about linking the price to lower prices in other countries. he now wants Congress to pass a version of that most favored nation. I mean, where do you stand on that?
You know, again, looking at why do drugs cost so much in this country? Because we have led the world, and we've done such a great job in innovation. I look at my practice, the 30 plus years of my practice. I used to have to tell prostate cancer patients after just basically one intervention, it was time to get your affairs in order. We don't have to do that anymore. I can now say we have this alternative, this alternative, this alternative, and so many different things. So our pharmaceutical industry, our scientists have been such great innovators. It costs. You know, to bring an average drug to market can bring anywhere from $2.5 to $3.5 billion. So many molecules fail. But how do we get those to market, and how do we actually make innovation profitable, which it has to be, but to take the money out where it doesn't need to be. So if you go over to Europe, you go to other countries, they've been basically living a great life, paying less than 10% of what we do for our regular drugs. Now you go to a lot of those markets, and there's a market reduction in formulators. They don't have the access to the wonderful cures that we have here in the United States. So the president, absolutely pure in trying to bring down the cost of medicine. Again, I'm going to go back to the middleman part, which I believe is the main driver of the high cost of pharmaceuticals. And you know, I've met with many pharmaceutical CEOs and said, look, what are you doing? What are you doing to bring down the cost of medicine? I'll take a little aside here. One of the banes of my existence up here is the damn commercials that we see on television. That, again, there's only one country in the world that does this, New Zealand, and we add $20 billion to the cost of medicines in this country. That needs to go away. The advertisers wouldn't like this. Are we price fixing? Or are we going to actually do more harm than good in the MFN? And let me give you an example for that. China has been on the up and up and up. They are really skyrocketing their innovation in their pharmaceutical industry. What we don't want to do is price ourselves out of the market with Europe, and all of a sudden they choose the cheaper Chinese alternative, which we know they don't have the controls, they don't care about the environment, they don't care about patients' rights. So there is a balance with this. How that gets codified and how we do something, I think, is a real challenge.
Okay. Yeah, so yeah, certainly concerns about innovation on that front. Let's shift just broader in the healthcare space. Obviously, Secretary Kennedy, RFK, is up on the Hill doing a lot of hearings. He was before the Ways and Means Committee last week that you're on. We saw, obviously, Democrats are sort of going after him on vaccine policy, job turmoil, FDA, CDC. What were your kind of takeaways from his hearing at your committee, and what did you make of, I mean, do you share some of the concerns around vaccines or FDA policy?
You know, I've always been a person that's tried to look past the noise and get to the substance of the matter. You know, we can deal with personalities all day long. The real question is vaccines. Why are we having such an issue with that these days? I'm going to go back to Anthony Fauci. I believe his arrogance and the fact that there was a monolithic approach during his administration really caused, in my opinion, the greatest vaccine hesitancy that there's been. It is okay for the House of Medicine to question, are we doing the right things? And now, the spokesman sometimes can get the heat from this, and maybe the delivery isn't always the best. But it's okay for us to question things. You look at what's happened with our peanut allergy. We caused a generation of individuals to be allergic to peanuts because of arrogance and pride within the House of Medicine. Same thing with postmenopausal Premarin. So it's okay to question some of these things. Again, the purpose of a vaccine is to blunt the effects of someone who is at risk or possibly with the transmission of disease. We found that early on that we did not prevent the transmission of disease. So again, it's okay to question some of these things. It's good for America. It's good for the American patient so that we have good scientists that have good debate. Sometimes we just have to look through the noise.
All right, well, that's a note we're going to leave it on. We're out of time, so thanks so much, Congressman.
Great, thank you.
Thanks a lot. All right, so we're going to keep the conversation going. We have another member of Congress, this time a Democrat. She's a pediatrician. So please join me in welcoming Congresswoman Kim Schrier. Thanks so much for joining us.
Good morning.
So as I said, I mean, you also are a physician, a pediatrician. So let's go to your experience in practicing medicine. I mean, where have you kind of seen the most barriers, whether it's around cost or other, access issues for patients?
Well, I'm a pediatrician, so that's one thing that is different between Dr. Murphy and myself. I am a primary care doc. So interestingly, I have not personally, so therefore I don't see patients with Medicare because those are older patients, generally speaking. And so I haven't gone through a lot of the struggles with prior authorization that I see as a barrier. I think the biggest barrier right now is just that people are lacking insurance, that we made incredible strides with the Affordable Care Act and with expansion of Medicaid, getting up to, in my state, 95% coverage. And that meant that people could afford to be covered and they could then see a doctor. And right now, a lot of people are in a situation where they can't go see a primary doc and they certainly can't afford to go see a specialist.
So what do we think? I mean, obviously there was the whole debate around the Affordable Care Act tax credits that ended up expiring. I mean, what do we need to be doing now to get more people coverage or to address that issue?
Well, we have bipartisan agreement. I believe we got 14 Republicans to join us in forcing a bill to the floor that would resume those tax credits that help people afford to pay their health insurance premiums. And we should do that, and we should undo the cuts to Medicaid that are going to leave patients high and dry.
On the sort of physician side of things, I mean, you've put a focus on primary care, including sort of boosting the Medicaid pay rates for primary care. Or talk about why that's important, and is that something that can be bipartisan and move forward?
It's interesting, the big battle, and this was, by the way, bipartisan sort of battling the budget, I would say. Both parties, all the doctors in Congress, wanted to at least bring Medicaid reimbursement up to Medicare reimbursement, which you just heard from Dr. Murphy is already stagnant and not good enough to sustain the medical profession. Now the fight is just having Medicaid, which is a whole different fight, and it's resulting in practices being gobbled up by private equity or hospitals, and it's resulting in physicians just deciding to retire early or resign entirely. And so, the fact of the matter is that Medicaid reimbursement, when you even have a Medicaid patient, is too low, and that for every patient visit, the doctor's office is losing money. And so many offices then will cap the number of patients that they see, whether that's with Medicaid or Medicare. And if everybody had a medical home, meaning a primary care physician, who children would see every year, catch problems early before you need to go to a specialist, this helps not just with patients and families and society. This also helps not having so many people need to see a specialist, and it brings down costs.
Yeah. The other part of your work I want to talk about is on diabetes. As a patient, you're working on this. I mean, and talk about, your experience, and then in terms of policy, I mean, what are your big priorities in that area right now?
So my personal relationship to this is that when I was 16, I was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes. And so I just this month hit 41 years of living healthy with this disease. But not everybody does. And a lot of that is a discrepancy between who has and does not have health care. And I will tell you, just as an anecdote, since we're talking a lot about Medicaid and Medicaid expansion, an endocrinologist, and actually an adult endocrinologist in my district, told me that as soon as the Medicaid got expanded, all these adults with type 1 diabetes, where their care had not been good, they had not had pumps or continuous glucose monitors, and had complications and were seeing specialists, came in, got the equipment because Medicaid does cover that, and then their blood sugars came down and they were healthy and they weren't getting hospitalized. And it's just an example of what happens when people can afford the care they need. So again, I will go back to making sure that everybody can afford the care they need, expanding those programs, and then of course, funding research. It has been a heartbreak for me, and I hope it's a heartbreak for everybody, that the US right now is essentially just ceding our position as the research crown jewel in the world by underfunding, defunding NIH under RFK Jr.'s HHS and ceding that ground to China.
Yeah, and we'll talk. I know you just talked to Secretary Kennedy, so we'll come back to that. On the diabetes front, though, I mean, I saw in the Senate now there's a bipartisan bill. They sort of joined two bills around capping insulin at $35. I mean, do you see that bill having a chance? I mean, it is bipartisan, I guess, in the Senate. So
I think it does have a chance. We did it. Democrats did this in Congress for patients on Medicare, capping out-of-pocket costs at $35 a month. What's interesting is that my own endocrinologist told me that as soon as that happened, the writing was on the wall for the pharmaceutical companies, who immediately dropped one of their long-acting, intermediate-acting, and quick-acting insulins down to an out-of-pocket cost of $35 a month. So it basically, we did it just for Medicare, and there was we'll call it a spillover effect. We'll probably talk about that later. There was then a spillover effect where the writing was on the wall, and we're seeing that also with inhalers and EpiPens. Like, the signal is out there that we need better behavior, and that medicines that have been around for a very long time and don't cost a lot to produce and are life-saving need to be available at an affordable rate.
That makes sense. And sort of just on drug prices more broadly, I mean, beyond insulin, obviously Democrats under President Biden passed the Inflation Reduction Act, Medicare negotiation of drug prices. I mean, would you like, if Democrats win back the House this year, so going into next year, I mean, would you like to see, there have been some proposals to expand the number of drugs that are, eligible under that, or are there other sort of expansions on the drug pricing front you'd like to see?
Well, we designed the Inflation Reduction Act to start with a small number of drugs because it is really a very thorough and thoughtfully considered negotiation to have to consider, the research that went in. Is this a breakthrough drug? How many lives is it going to save? Is it the first of its kind? To come up with what is a fair price, like that is a very deep philosophical and scientific conversation to have. And I think everybody listening today could agree that another kind of copycat Me Too allergy drug is different than a breakthrough Alzheimer's drug. So we designed this to start with 10 and then to slowly increase the number that would be negotiated each year in a fair way. And I believe that is what is happening already. It has been fair.
Last point on the drug pricing. I mean, I asked Congressman Murphy this. President Trump has his most favored nation plan around linking to prices in other countries, which we have. I mean, Bernie Sanders, there are people on the left who have proposed similar ideas. I mean, what do you make of that proposal? I mean, do you think you could vote for that in Congress if that came before Congress?
I think you're just starting on an unequal footing here. The countries we're talking about have national health care. People are covered. They pay higher taxes or fees or whatever you want to call it. They pay into a healthcare account, and then they have healthcare coverage, and that allows the entire nation to negotiate for lower drug prices. It's just a whole different schematic than we have. I mean, in Germany, my understanding is that all of the insurance companies come together and they all go and negotiate jointly with the drug companies and come up with a fair price. It's just a whole different way of doing business, and I think I agree with Dr. Murphy. Like, cracking down on the PBMs and the way they are jacking up prices in order to profit more, it is like job number 1, 2, and 3 here.
So let's get to, you mentioned Secretary Kennedy. He was just before Energy and Commerce that you sit on. Obviously, and as a pediatrician, vaccines are very, very important. I mean, what were your takeaways, I guess, from your questioning or from his hearing and what you saw from him?
Well, I mean, my takeaways started before I walked in the room. He's been a disaster for health in this country. I just don't think you have to be a genius to know that eating real food is good, that eating lower, on the food chain is good, and that that does not make up for allowing infectious diseases that are preventable to once again gain a foothold in this country. It's not an either or, it's a both. That's what pediatricians do every day when we counsel our patients, both about healthy living and eating and not being on screens and that kind of stuff, and with talking about how to prevent infectious diseases, whether that is through vaccinations or careful hand washing. And so I just think he has set our country back so many decades. And when he tries to wiggle out of this question, I've only been secretary for a year, you can't blame me. For 20 years, he has been a leading voice in the anti-vax movement. He's been scaring parents. He doesn't have to convince them that he's right. He just has to confuse parents. Because no parent out there, I'm a mom, nobody wants to do the wrong thing. And so we would kind of refer to the sin of omission and the sin of commission. Parents would rather not do something than do the wrong thing. And so now they're not giving vaccines because he's scared them. And then that's spilling over to not giving vitamin K shots at birth, which prevent brain bleeds and strokes in babies. And it's spilling over to not doing the newborn screen and the heel poke test. It is just spilling over to a distrust in healthcare that is setting our country back. Other countries are insisting that, or are recommending that their citizens get shots before coming here because the US has become a dangerous place.
And to that, he got some questions both from members. There's been some reporting in the press that the White House is trying to pivot a little bit and not do controversial vaccine moves in a midterm year. They're going to talk about healthy food instead, or more so at least. What do you make? Do you think that is kind of a strategy they're doing now this year, or what do you make of that?
Oh, they've clearly told him to shut up. This is wildly unpopular with the American population. It's even more wildly unpopular with older people who are more reliable voters because they have seen these diseases, they've had these diseases. Once you explain to people that we can now prevent meningitis, and so we have to stick needles in fewer babies' backs, it makes an impression. Once you explain to people that measles is not just a rash, so many people think that's all it is, and that babies suffer. To have somebody who is suggesting that we don't prevent those is just wildly out of sync with where America is. The president knows it. He sees the polling numbers, and he knows that RFK Jr. has become a liability, and frankly, you should fire him.
As we're getting towards the end, maybe to zoom out a bit, we talked a little about what could happen next year if Dems win the House, but and there are obviously a lot of priorities. But what kind of would be your biggest healthcare priorities if you are in the majority?
Making sure everybody's covered in an affordable way. That's number one. We need to bring down costs overall. Got to take on the PBMs. These are huge priorities. And we have to figure out how to start taking a hatchet to the vertical integration, the consolidation of the healthcare system, such that insurance companies are controlling everything, profiting, and basically directing healthcare through prior authorizations, formularies, and the like. Decisions need to come back to doctors and patients working together and not be dictated by a big business model.
Yeah, well, that's all the time we have. Thanks so much for joining us and for this conversation. It's our last speaker of the day, so thanks to all of you for coming again. There's coffee and there's snacks, so feel free to hang out. And you can sign up for Vitals, our healthcare newsletter at Axios.com if you haven't already. So thanks again for coming, everybody. Thanks.